So this really is one of my favorite topics. I love to think of a sermon in terms of adventure. In fact, I often tell people who I talk to about preaching or maybe come to some of my preaching workshops, do not walk people through a sermon outline. Puts them to sleep. Take them on a sermon adventure where they have to stay awake. Every sermon with a really good adventure needs to have one of two dilemmas, sometimes both, but always needs to have at least one of these two. One of those dilemmas is, how is the preacher going to get out of this mess that he's put himself in? Really lines up with those messages where you start with the Bible. And when you start with the Bible, you acknowledge all the ways you've read it wrong, all the ways it perplexes you, all the way this particular story, you can say things to the people like, you're not going to believe that this is in the Bible, that what I'm fixing to read to you is really in the Bible, but it is. I think back to a message that I had recently in a series about marriage, and the messages in that series all came from the end of Genesis chapter 2, where God gives the first bride away in the first institution he creates, which is marriage. But one Sunday in that series, I began by saying, you know, or maybe you don't know, that the Bible was not written originally with chapters and verses. And because we have read it with chapters and verses, we have misread what Genesis's author really wants to say about marriage. Because at the end of Genesis chapter 2, they were naked, not ashamed. And then the chapter stops. And most of us close our Bibles then. And we pick it up at Genesis 3 the next day. That's not how it was written. And all of a sudden, I'm in a predicament. And the people are thinking, well, preacher, are you saying the Bible's wrong? What are you going to teach us about how the Bible was put together that we didn't know before? And I was able to say, Genesis's author is brilliant. He's a genius. He's the one who's inspired by the Holy Spirit. And in his inspiration, there was no pause. There was no breath between the end of Genesis chapter 2 and the beginning of Genesis chapter 3 and the first line of Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was craftier than any other animal in the garden. So you have marriage and immediately the serpent, which lets us know marriage is under attack. Your marriage is under attack. The institution of marriage is under attack. And so I started out from that dilemma of actually how the Bible, the nuts and bolts of how the Bible is put together, and landed at a bottom line that since our marriages are under attack, fight for your marriage more than you fight with your mate, which I think ended up being a pretty good resolution on a sermon adventure, resolving a predicament that I put myself in. So adventure makes a sermon more memorable because you have people, if you do it well, on the edge of the seat. They don't know how you're going to get out of the predicament that you have crafted and designed. They don't know if your message really veers not so much to the preacher's predicament, but to your predicament, the hearer. How are they going to get out of this diagnosis that you have put upon them? When you say things like, someone here today is planning on leaving your family this week. There's someone in the sound of my voice who last night was on your laptop computer at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you can't believe I just said that. So where's the resolution going to come from those sorts of dilemmas that the preacher doesn't have to create? He just has to name them. Those dilemmas are already going on in people's lives. And when you can name them, people are all of a sudden in an adventure to which the gospel and the gospel alone brings clarity and resolution and hope. So what role should the preacher himself play in these adventures that he crafts? Man, I would say, don't ever be the hero of your own story. The preacher needs to be observer. The preacher needs to be learner. Maybe the preacher even needs to be cheerleader of someone else in the congregation who you see being the hero of that story, who you see living out the resolution of that adventure. So as you craft the stories, as you excavate your own mind and your own history, make sure that even if there is a story where you kind of look good at the end, you soft pedal that. Remember to highlight those ones where you're sort of befuddled at the beginning. By the end, you've learned, but you're still not the hero. If you're not the hero of your story, Jesus has a much better chance of being the hero of your sermon, which is what we all want.